Welcome to the Big Scientist channel. Today we're getting to some funky food science called sourdough. Sourdough bread has been baked and eaten for centuries. And in recent years, sourdough has had a resurgence in popularity due to the recent pandemic and post-pandemic years. Because of this resurgence, many people are diving into the sourdough world, which begins with something called a sourdough starter. Sourdough starter may seem like a complex mystery to some, but in reality, it is an economic, easily accessible, and healthier approach to bread making. It also happens to be bursting at the seams of science. So let's get into it. The process of creating a sourdough starter is actually a very simple process. It only has two ingredients, flour and water. Now, you might be asking yourself, how is that possible that there's only two ingredients in a sourdough starter? Well, it has to do with some science. So wheat and grains are naturally contain a lot of different bacteria and yeast or fungi. As they grow outside and they're in the air and the elements in the soil, they gain these microorganisms. And when the wheat stalk or the grain is harvested and then milled into flour, all of these microorganisms go along for the ride. So when you go to the grocery store and buy a bag of flour or a box of flour, you are pretty much buying a bag of flour that's housing billions, if not trillions, of different microorganisms just waiting to fuel your next baking adventure. And the water that we're going to add, it actually is a vehicle to activate the dormant microorganisms that are in our flour. It also activates the flour proteins, glutathin and glycogen, to create something called gluten. Now, gluten is developed when water interacts with, as mentioned, the flour proteins glutathin and glycogen. And this gluten is actually what the microorganisms require to feed on. The two byproducts that are produced by these microorganisms feeding on the gluten are carbon dioxide, which is produced by the yeast, and lactic acid, which gives us that tangy sour flavor that sourdough is known for, and that's produced by the bacteria. So these byproducts actually give sourdough its rise when it's baking with the CO2, and then its signature tangy flavor via the lactic acid from the bacteria. And so now we're going to ask ourselves, why is sourdough considered a healthier bread option than normal breads? So this is due not only to the diverse natural yeast and bacteria, the different microorganisms that are present in a sourdough starter, because they're beneficial microorganisms that benefit health and a healthy bacterial flora in the body. But the thing is, they don't survive the baking process necessarily, but they are present in the starter and the sourdough while it's being prepared. The main thing that a lot of people really focus on is the lactic acid production by the bacteria, because the lactic acid actually breaks down the gluten, which is in the bread dough. And not a lot of people, but some people are sensitive to gluten. They have gluten allergies. And since this gluten is broken down by this lactic acid, it actually makes the bread more easily digestible, and this is good for everyone, really. It helps you digest the bread easier when you consume it, and it just is better than a normal bread loaf that has full gluten structure. Now that we understand the science behind a sourdough starter and what it is, how it reacts to produce those delicious sourdough loaves, bread loaves, let's go ahead and get back into how do we make our sourdough starter. So as mentioned, it's really easy. It's simple. You really just need two ingredients, flour and water. And it's preferred to use filtered water just because if there's any minerals or any chemicals in the water that you get from your tap or well, it could potentially hinder the bacterial growth in your starter. So to start out, we're just going to use 125 grams or a 3/4 cup of flour. And this can be any kind of flour. All-purpose flour, wheat flour, rye flour, bread flour are all good options. You really can use any flour, as I mentioned, because the grain grows outside and it gathers all these microorganisms. It usually will have microorganisms available to create a starter. The only thing you want to watch out for is if your flour is bleached. That could remove some of those microorganisms. And then you also want a flour that has a nice high protein content, because as mentioned, those flour proteins are what the microorganisms are feeding off of, so that gluten from the flour protein development. And because of this, cake flour really isn't used for starters just because it has a very low protein content and it typically is bleached. So just stay away from cake flour. But yes, you need 125 grams of, or 3/4 cup of flour, and then 125 grams or 1/2 cup of filtered water. And what you're gonna do is just gonna weigh them out, mix them up in a clean glass jar, and set it aside for about 48 hours. And then in 48 hours, when you see it starting to bubble and create some gases, that's the gases you're seeing when you see the bubbles, you're gonna do what we call a feeding. And the feeding is just pretty much feeding the bacteria. It's alive, it's a microorganism, it's alive, so you have to continue to feed it. Because if it runs out of gluten to eat, then it's not gonna produce any more carbon dioxide or lactic acid for our sourdough bread. So to feed your starter, what you're gonna do is you're gonna get another clean jar, or you're just gonna remove a little over half of the mixture. So since we added 125 and 125, that's 200. We're gonna remove about 200 grams of the flour or the starter mix, and you should be left with just a small amount, about 50 grams. And even if it's less, this will still work. So you just really need some starter to keep feeding. And the point of feeding this is to help that bacteria and the microorganisms to really regenerate and start kicking in and really getting really active, so we can have a nice bubbly starter to make nice big flour or sourdough loaves. And to do this, you have to keep feeding it. But to feed it, as I mentioned, you have to have about 50 grams of starter, and to that you're going to add 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water, and just mix it up and let it sit again. And you're just going to feed it every day for about 2 weeks until you start getting really good activity with your sourdough starter, and then it's ready to use. The sourdough starter is good for lots of different things. You can use it not just to bake bread loaves, but also to make pancakes, make cookies, bagels, all types of things. Anything that really has yeast or a leavening agent, such as baking powder and baking soda, you can substitute sourdough starter in for that. And it gives the baked good not only a tangy sourdough flavor, but it also can, like mentioned, break down some of that gluten to make it a little bit easier digestible. And it's just fun to just use your own creation to kind of make these other things. And as a standard for replacing any sourdough starter into any recipe, the main is use 100 grams of sourdough starter for 7 grams of dry yeast, which is equivalent to 1 packet of dry yeast. So if anything's calling for that amount of yeast, then you can substitute your sourdough starter at 100 grams per 7 grams or packet of dry yeast. Now that you know the science behind sourdough starter, it's time to get out there and explore the funky world of sourdough. So until next time, happy baking!